And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author, John F. Coverdale, author of Saxum, The Life of Alvaro del Portillo, Scepter Press publisher. Hey, great to have you back here again.
Pleasure to be here.
It's been a few years. This is about the fourth time we've gotten together.
I think that's right.
Going back, I think, maybe almost 10 or 11 years.
I don't like to think about it.
First time we said, well, you look the same. A couple of the ones that people would remember, which you were actually the author for, was Uncommon Faith, the Early Years of Opus Dei, and then also Putting Down Roots, which had to do with the founder of Opus Dei, basically here, or the person who got it started in the United States.
Father Joseph Muskis, yes.
Muskis, right. Now, is his cause, or
his
what's
cause
his status
is
now?
Open in the Archdiocese of Boston, and they've pretty much finished the hearing all the witnesses and collecting the information. And I think about the only thing left now in Boston is for a closing ceremony with a cardinal, and then they'll package up all the information and send it off to Rome.
Okay, well, obviously the founder is a saint.
Yes.
Now we're to talk about someone else that he at least referred to as Saxum. Who was that, and what did he mean when he wrote that?
Well, the person was Alvaro del Portillo, who was one of the early members of Opus Dei, and who eventually became St. Josemaria's closest collaborator and then his successor. And a number of times in writing to him, he would say Saxum, which means rock or bedrock. And he would say, because he was someone he felt so keenly that he could really rely on, someone who was a rock.
Now, was he part of the original group that got founded?
Yes.
Okay.
So he joined Opus Dei in 1935. So the foundation, 1928, there's only St. Josemaria, that nobody associated with him. And then gradually a few people, at that time probably 8 or 10, something like that. Okay,
because I know you mentioned here, he first encountered him, if I remember, there was, he was talking, chapter 1, got to talking with some other students involved in the St. Vincent de Paul Society about a young priest who was becoming known in Madrid.
Right.
And there's something about bananas.
Bananas. Well, it's simply that St. Josemaria had met a few years earlier Don Alvaro. We often call him Don Alvaro, which is just a term of respect in Spanish. Had met Don Alvaro's aunt, and she had told them about this wonderful nephew she had and how bright he was. But as a little boy, he really liked bananas, but he couldn't say it right, and he would say Plátanos instead of Platanos or something like that. And he was impressed that at their first meeting, this priest remembered that he had been told that about him.
And that he took him as a student very seriously.
Right, and made an appointment with him and so on.
But he stood him up.
Well, he did stand him up, that's right. He did stand him up for the appointment, and Don Alvaro, kind of excused it and said, well, I imagine he had to go out on a sick call or something. But when he wrote about it, the term he did use was to say, he stood me up.
He stood him up. Now, it was interesting, too, because he became a priest, but in reading the book, was he always thinking of being a priest? It seemed like he always felt like he was dedicating his life to Christ, but did he see himself as in the priesthood?
No, I think the answer to that is no. And I think until literally the day before he joined Opus Dei, I don't think he had thought of himself as dedicating himself to Christ. He thought of himself as someone who was trying to be a good Catholic and to live a good life and to become an engineer and raise a family and so on.
Because that's what he was trained as, an engineer.
He was training as an engineer, and then he met St. Josemaria, explained to him about Opus Dei, and in, I think, really quite uncharacteristic fashion, because he was a man who thought things through carefully and didn't jump at things. But the next day, he joined Opus Dei. But at that time, Opus Dei was a group of young men around this young priest in Madrid. St. Josemaria was the only priest. No one had ever been ordained for Opus Dei, and there was no structure existing that could ordain priests. So no, I don't think he was thinking about the priesthood at all when he joined Opus Dei.
Right, because I think you talk about even in the fact that when thinking about having priests, there were some canonical issues that would normally have to be dealt with, right?
Big complicated ones. I don't think we probably want to spend a lot of time trying to work on that.
The diocese and who calls you, etc. The one thing I thought was interesting in thinking about Opus Dei, too, in talking about, when he first became involved with it, was talking about the foundational vision also made it clear to Escriva that sanctity is not an individualistic pursuit.
Right. Well, I think basically what Pope Francis is insisting on so much right now, and particularly in the Apostolic Exhortation, that we that we're all called to spread the love of Christ to other people, that it's not just about question of being good or even being holy in some way, that we have to go out and we have to look for others and spread that word. And that's what I meant by that.
Now, in chapter 4, you say, from the very beginning of his vocation to Opus Dei, he seems to have received a special grace in the form of a particularly intense sense of being a son of the founder. How did you come up with that conclusion?
Well, I think just his whole, basically his whole life reflects that. And from very early on in his vocation, on the one hand, he really made himself available to St. Josemaria in striking ways, offering to quit his studies of engineering if need be in order to work on Opus Dei. And St. Josemaria signaled him out as someone whom he could particularly rely on. But it was always with this sense, I think, of that St. Josemaria, the founder, is the father of this family, and I am his son, and that's what I have to do. And it was very striking. In St. Josemaria's later life, he had a fair number of meetings with large numbers of people, thousands, in auditoriums where he'd answer questions, basically. And Don Alvaro was always there. Now, he had heard everything hundreds of times, but he was completely attentive. There's a kind of wonderful story of one of those get-togethers. A woman stands up and says, well, Father, a friend of mine was at your get-together yesterday, and she commented on how Don Alvaro was looking at you and the affection he showed. And she commented, you know, he must have heard this stuff hundreds of times. And St. Josemaria was very, I think, moved and pleased and said, yes, in Opus Dei, we love each other.
Right. And also, I would think with all of these things, too, it's like reading scripture or anything else. Many times there's new insights and things one can glean by even hearing the same things over and over again, and going deeper in what's being said, too.
That's certainly true.
Now, you also mentioned the fact that on page 39, that he took very much to heart Christ's admonition that whoever wishes to follow him must take up his cross daily. And he talks about some penitential kind of things, some that are a little tougher than others. This one I think maybe I could do, which is stop putting salt on my eggs.
Well, I think you probably could.
That was one of the ones he used.
I think you probably could, sure.
Especially for Lent. And of course, this book came out several months ago, and this month, basically here in September, one of the reasons you wrote this book, I'm assuming, is because of his status, right?
Yes, so he will be beatified on the 27th of September in Madrid. Yes.
Yeah, now that's interesting too. People might say, well, Madrid. Now, years ago, when we were at least under John Paul II many times, when the beatifications would happen, they would actually happen in Rome.
Right.
And then I believe it's under Benedict, when Pope Benedict was in, he changed it back to, which I believe was an earlier practice of actually having the beatifications done.
I think that's right. Or at least Pope Benedict said St. Peter's Square only for canonizations.
Right.
I don't think he said it had to be outside of Rome. And we, I believe, looked for another place in Rome and said there's no place big enough.
Okay, I see, right. The other thing you point out here, which I thought was interesting, on page 64, when he was talking to St. Josemaria and basically talking about dedicating himself to what, Opus Dei and stuff, but he hadn't finished school yet.
Right.
And then he said he was encouraged to finish his studies, and I know elsewhere there's a point where I guess the idea of having, in a sense, a spiritual degrry and then a more secular degree was the goal.
Well, right.
Is that to have one foot in both worlds?
I don't know if I'd put it quite that way. No, St. Josemaria would say that we have to have both feet on the earth and our head in heaven.
I see, okay.
But he did want the priests of Opus Dei to have a doctorate in some civil subject, as well as a doctorate in either canon law or theology or philosophy, etc. But at this time, I think, yes, I guess he was probably thinking that Alvaro would become a priest of Opus Dei at the time of this incident. But in any case, it wasn't yet clear how that was going to happen or when it was going to happen. So I think he also wanted him to finish the degree so he could work.
I see, and earn a living.
Right.
Okay. Now in chapter 9, talking about the priests of Opus Dei, you say the mission of priests in Opus Dei would be exclusively spiritual, not directing the secular activities of the other members. So that was his vision for what the priest should do.
Right.
Why was he concerned about having it be that versus directing secular activities?
Well, I think it reflects, first of all, I think really an understanding of the autonomy of laymen. Okay, that laymen are not meant to be in the church father's little helper.
Right, exactly.
That we are full-fledged citizens of the church, and we have our rights and our duties and our autonomy. Put another way, St. Josemaria had a real allergy to clericalism, to the clergy doing this and the clergy running that, and the clergy expressing their opinions on politics. And he said, that's not the role of the clergy. It's the laity who are called to sanctify the world from within, right?
Yeah, very much of what we see today, you know, post-Vatican II,
That's right.
certainly that's standing out and saying that is the call of the laity, the proper call. I think sometimes, at least growing up in the 60s and the 70s, it seemed to be this understanding that what was supposed to happen is the lay people were supposed to run up on the altar,
right,
and then the priest left the altar by the side door, instead of it being, no, what you're supposed to do is be empowered by your faith to go out and convert the world, right?
Exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, kind of a difference between a ministry and an apostolate in many cases for many of these people.
And I think it's very interesting, you know, Pope John Paul wrote a fair amount about that, and in the kind of the statement that I think is most significant, which was a document called Ecclesia in America, he talks about ministries, and he talks about sanctifying the world from within, but then he says, but let it be clear that the primary function of the laity is to sanctify the world from within.
Right, exactly. Right. And you mentioned John Paul II, and in the introduction you talk about, you know, on February 23rd, 1994, John Paul II arrived at Opus Dei's headquarters in Rome for the wake of Bishop Alvaro del Portillo, the prelate of Opus Dei, who had died early that morning. And he's there, and someone asks him, you know, your Holy Father, you know, thank you so much, in fact, for coming. And he said, I had to come, I had to.
Right.
Why did he?
Well, of course, only he knows why
he
exactly said that. But I speculate that it's three things. I think the first was that he was extraordinarily good friends with Don Alvaro, and they were really quite close. Second, I think he was recognizing the very great services that Don Alvaro had given to the church over the years. And finally, I think he probably also recognized that this was a truly holy man. But we'd have to ask John Paul II to know exactly what he meant.
Hopefully we'll see him sometime in the future.
I hope so.
Now, you also write in the introduction, following on talking about Don Alvaro, that he was a model of fortitude, patience, humility, concern for others, affection, and other admirable traits. Above all, perhaps his life reflected the virtue of fidelity. Fidelity to God, to his personal vocation, Opus Dei, to its founder, St. Josemaria Escriva, whom he supported unwaveringly from the time he met in 1935 until Escriva's death in 1975. In the almost 20 years following that event, he continued to demonstrate as the head of Opus Dei complete fidelity to the founder's spirit in fulfillment, he believed, of the will of God.
Yes.
So that's really, really important when you see organizations or any, in this personal prelature, an apostolate, or some other mission, that they stay true to the core mission of the founder, right? The founders.
I think it's essential, yes.
Right, and I think when you see problems, you see it's because they've wandered away from that many times.
Right. But I think in the case of Opus Dei, perhaps in the case of many other organizations, but I can speak to Opus Dei, that conviction was based on if you like, a deeper conviction that Opus Dei wasn't St. Josemaria's creation, that it was
That's why I meant that
given
the will
to him
of God
by
was
God.
in there. Right. Okay. That's what I was interested in.
And St. Josemaria was very explicit about that. He'd say, "Look, I'm just a poor instrument here."
Well, he had an experience, obviously, in 1928.
He did, yes, and he never explained what it was. All he ever said was, "I saw Opus Dei."
Right.
And he always said it in exactly the same terms. But it was clear that he had this very firm conviction, which he passed on to Don Alvaro and to the rest of us, that as the Bishop of Madrid said once, he was asked by another bishop at a time when there's a lot of controversy about Opus Dei, you know, what about this Opus Dei? And he said, you can be sure that the opus is really Dei, that the work is really of God.
Of God. Yeah. And also on page 77, there's a conversation. It says that engineers in Spain enjoyed a great social prestige and look forward to a brilliant career. By contrast, priests, especially secular priests, generally enjoyed little prestige. Upon learning that Alvaro was going to be ordained, even the Archbishop of Madrid asked him, do you realize that you'll lose your identity? Now you are a prestigious engineer. Then you will be one priest among many. He replied, Your Excellency, I gave my identity to Jesus many years ago. In reading his life, and you actually met him, right?
Right, I did.
Well, what was your sense of that?
Well, my sense was that he was completely identified with this vocation he had received, and that's why I think faithfulness is, I think, his characteristic virtue, right? That he had this sense, God has called me to this. This is a work of God, and that's who I am.
So there's no question in my mind. This is what I'm called to do.
This is what I'm called to do, and I don't have any other kind of side goals. It's not, well, I'm going to do this, but I've also got to make sure that my golf game doesn't suffer or whatever.
Right.
I mean, it was a complete dedication, and to the service also of the founder. I mean, I was very struck. I worked in an office there in Rome where we saw St. Josemaria almost every day. And on many occasions, Don Alvaro was there, silent, just there, in case he was needed. And it was particularly striking because we were meeting in a conference room that you didn't even have to go out to the hall to get to his office. There was a door right from the conference room into his office. So he could so easily have been working on something in his office. If he was needed, in 10 seconds he was there.
Walk inside. Right.
Or he could have been sitting there but reading something or writing something, an ear cocked and a question asked.
Like
and
many
he
people
answers.
do in meetings,
Yeah.
right? Sure, okay.
But he didn't do that. He was there listening.
Was that as an example as well for others, do you think?
Oh, I think it was. It was a
right.
striking example of availability and of putting aside his, and he had a lot of work to do. It wasn't that he didn't have anything else to do. He was, the years I was there were the years of the Vatican Council. He was the secretary of a commission at the council, and he had a lot to do for Opus Dei. So he would have been perfectly justified in thinking, I've got important things to do that I can combine with being available to the founder.
Multitasking, but he wasn't multitasking.
He wasn't multitasking.
He had his task,
Yeah.
and that's what it was. Now, one of the things interesting, and certainly in the Uncommon Faith book, which went from 28 to 43, you know, some of it, and you allude to it here as well, and you talk about it in the book. Obviously, you've got the Spanish Civil War going on. There was a lot of anti-clericalism, a lot of priests were killed, etc. You talk a little bit about that in the book, and even some of the separation where people didn't see each other for periods of time because of where they happened to be trapped at some part of the war. But there's also, during World War II, there's a later story. On page 79, during the flight, an Italian airliner carrying him found itself in the middle of a battle between British bombers and Axis ships. Many of the travelers were terrified. Some actors returning to Italy from Spain began to shout, "Mamma mia, this is really dangerous. We're all going to drown." But Don Alvaro stayed calm and thinking to himself, I'm going to carry out a mission that God wants, and therefore nothing will happen.
Yes, and I think that was his attitude really throughout life. It wasn't just that one. That was a dramatic incident, but he had this confidence that we are here to do God's will, and it may be hard, there may be setbacks, there may be difficulties, but God's grace is with us. And I think that's why he was an extraordinarily peaceful and serene man. I mean, nothing fazed him.
And that was your experience when you met him,
It was my experience when I met him, and and then learning more about his life as I've been writing this book. You just see even in situations were really very difficult, and things didn't seem to be going well at all, but he just, everything will be fine.
What's interesting, too, is because you talk about how loyal and supportive, in a sense, in the background, he was right there. But then he, as a successor coming on and then being responsible, from what I read in the book, a fairly wide, worldwide expansion of Opus, which had been obviously the founder's desire, but he had only gotten it so far. How does one transform from being, in a sense, that kind of silent keeper of the flame to actually being the person out front?
Well, I think at one level it has to be pretty difficult. Okay. At another level, though, I think it's, in a way, simply saying my whole role is been my whole life to try to do what God asks of me. Now he's asking this something else. But he did, I mean, for instance, St. Josemaria had established this kind of tradition of meeting with big groups of people and answering their questions about God and Christian life and so on. And at first, Don Alvaro said, I don't think I can do that.
Okay.
I mean, because St. Josemaria was sort of a showman and a big personality and very ebullient and outgoing. And Don Alvaro was a quiet man. He said he became an engineer rather than a lawyer. His father was a lawyer. So I wanted to become an engineer. Well, because engineers don't have to talk to people.
Right. That's.
And then he would sometimes comment on it and say, well, I said that, but here I am standing in front of thousands of you. And,
but it's always, in a sense, that's that sign of contradiction, that thing where our Lord sends to take people out of their comfort zones and use them differently. Even we remember in the scriptures the whole idea with, Peter, in a sense, or even Moses with his brother saying, taking the one who's not supposed to be the one to do it and say, no, it's not him, it's you. You have to do it.
Well, I'm sure he prayed a lot about these things, you know.
Now, he was ordained along with two others in 44. So actually that experience that he did was before he was actually ordained. Now, when that happened, so the laymen were called to the priesthood, in a sense, and ultimately they were called by Saint Josemaria, and by then he had gotten some permissions to be able to do that. Okay.
That's correct.
And is
so
that
they were ordained as priests of Opus Dei.
Okay, and so is that how it still works today?
That's exactly how it works today. So people join Opus Dei, I would say, probably with no thought of becoming a priest, although there are now a lot of priests of Opus Dei, so a young man joining Opus Dei might think, well, maybe someday I'll be
I was
called
wondering,
to the
would
priesthood.
somebody join with you? I feel like I have a call to the priesthood, but I really like and feel drawn to the spirituality of the founder of Opus Dei, and so I go into it.
I think if that were the case, I think then the person would go to the seminary, become a diocesan priest, and join what we call the Priestly Society of the Holy Cross.
Okay.
But I think someone who joins Opus Dei as a member of Opus Dei joins it with the idea of sanctifying his profession, whatever that happens to be, whether it's a lawyer or a lathe operator or whatever. Now, I think nowadays certainly people are aware, well, there are a fair number of priests of Opus Dei, so it's possible that someday I might be asked if I would be willing to be ordained, but I don't think anybody joins Opus Dei with that desire. And I think if someone told us, I'd really like to join Opus Dei because I want to become a priest, I think we'd say, well, wait a second, there's something that's not quite what we're about.
With where you are, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And as I alluded to earlier on page 178, you say Opus Dei continued to expand numerically, geographically, and in the range of its apostolic activities. Opus Dei grew from 60,000 members at the founder's death to 78,000 at the del Portillo's death. During the same time, approximately 800 members of Opus Dei were ordained priests. So how many priests of Opus Dei are there?
There's about 2,000.
About 2,000. That's worldwide?
Yes.
Okay. And it said here that Opus Dei had centers in 32 countries, and that was at one time. What is it today? Do you know?
I don't know the exact number, but I would guess it's somewhere around 70 or so.
70. Okay.
So we're kind of all over North and South America, all over Europe, and a smattering of countries in Africa and Asia.
Now, he's going to be beatified this month. How does the process, was there a miracle associated with it? I think you talk about it in the book, right?
There is a miracle. It involved an infant in Chile who was born with a whole bunch of pretty serious health problems, was undergoing surgery at a few days from birth. Did okay in the surgery, but then his heart failed and started beating slower and slower. They tried artificial pumping his heart and so on, but the doctors were giving up and said to his mother, she asked, is he dead? They said yes. And then his heart began to pick up again, but he had been without normal heartbeat for a half hour. So the thought was that if he was survived, that he'd be terribly compromised. And he's a healthy 12-year-old now, or 10, whatever it is. Yeah.
And she had prayed for his...
She was praying to St. Josemaria, to St. Don Alvaro, pardon me.
That's right. For Don Alvaro to intercede.
Yeah.
So that's happening. You've got this book. It's been out a couple of months. You know, I think you're on sabbatical, so that means you're taking it easy now. Is that my understanding?
Well, I've got another book in the works.
I was going to say, can you want to tell us a little bit of what you might be working on?
Well, actually, the other book I'm working on is a set of short biographies of people of Opus Dei. Some of them who have causes of beatification open, some of them who don't. One of my favorites, really, he doesn't have a cause, and I kind of doubt that he ever will, but it was just a wonderful man who was one of the very first married members of Opus Dei in Milwaukee.
Which is where you're from, right?
Where I'm from. Right. He was a plumber, And I kind of liked the fact that he wasn't even a terribly successful plumber. He started working for a plumbing firm, and then after a while went out on his own, and then after a while said, I've got to go back and work for somebody else. I'm not making a living. Yeah. But he was an extraordinarily good man.
Well, we need more good men like yourself as well, and authors writing about good men, and hopefully, and people here on EWTN, I'm sure will be able to see our coverage of the Beatification later this month. And look for your book, John Coverdale. Saxum is the name of the book, The Life of Alvaro del Portillo, published by Scepter Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.